So we're going to start off by doing an actual project analysis of the house and of the land that's surrounding the property. So you're going to have to print off the 11 by 17 PDF in order to start reviewing or drawing the details in that I will have on this particular property. So there's things that you have to be aware of. For instance, there's a series of windows along the house here that we're going to include in our project because we don't want anything interfering with these windows. So this in itself is a dinette space, and the dinette will have view of the deck area. So we don't want anything interfering with that. There's also a door. This is the primary door that we're going to access into the yard from the kitchen. The kitchen is here. It has a sort of an L-shaped table. There's a big window over here. This is of no concern of you, only that you need to know that the kitchen has a view in this direction and will have views through this window area. There is a actual island there, and then there's some larger windows that are here and here, and again they must have an unobstructed view. This is the great room, and the great room has views of the backyard, and the backyard is 100 acres. It goes on to a next concession. There's some beautiful landscaping on the concession that's beyond that. There's a hill with a farm. It's beautiful views. This particular element also has a number of posts, and this is from the timber frame that pre-exists on the property. We must be aware of that. Now the great room actually internally has a step up into a dining room. And the dining room itself has these two beautiful doors that will open up into the deck area. And that step up is significant because you have to be aware that there must be somewhere a step up from this location to this location. This is a media room. It's left dark. It will be under a canopy, so you can put anything in front of it because it really doesn't have a view outside of it. And that's really all that there is to that. Now, the other thing you should be aware of is what the different site requirements are. So down here we have beautiful, spectacular views, like I mentioned to you, of the acreage that's in front of it. This faces west, so this is west. This is the north side face. This is the south side face. And these are all very significant pieces of information you have to be aware of because they also affect the sunrise and the sunset. So in order to take a look at that, we have in the late summertime, the sun sets here, and June 21st is usually the date for the latest the sun will set in the evening sky, and this is around December 21st where the sun will set. And the path of the sun here is fairly flat, and the path of the sun here is fairly dramatic. So you'll have this path here that will basically travel along there, whereas this one tends to be a bit flatter. So you're going to get high sun angles in through here, and then it will sunset down to here, which will be nice and flat. But as it comes across the sort of 12 to 1 o'clock range, this is where the sun will be more or less the same, only that this is at a very shallow angle and this is at a very steep angle. Again, critical to your site layout. Now you also have other elements here you have to be aware of, and this is a strong one. Along here, we don't want any views because unfortunately the neighbor to that side has got some pretty ugly property. So we don't want any views along here. This is ideal for a screen. So we want some sort of screening. It could be man-made, it could be natural, but you must be aware that there's a screen in that area. The view out here is pretty nice. It's not too bad at all. It's tree lined, and so it's a bit more interesting. We also have different wind conditions. So predominantly in this part we have a westerly flow of wind and sometimes a northwesterly flow of wind. When it's really warm we have a southwesterly flow of wind, but the wind goes in this direction, and that's fairly consistent, and you should make note of that so that if you need any sort of wind barriers or anything like that, that's important, especially in the winter time when this is completely exposed. So when you're looking at the different sort of segments in here, because this is the dining room area in here, This is the formal um, space that you'd also entertain guests. So it makes a lot of sense in that particular space to have some area that's designated to guests. So somewhere in here, somewhere in this area, this would be where you'd have the guests uh, arriving, visiting, staying. So this is more suitable for that two-seater couch, two individual tubs, and a coffee table. And whether it's in this area or something that extends out in this area, doesn't matter. It's all of this kind of area. Then you have the dinette and the kitchen. So it makes a lot of sense to have something very similar to that in this particular area here. So wherever it may be, this is most likely where you're going to have your outdoor kitchen. And the reason being is because of proximity, how close it is to there. Now, again, that could be something that stretches out that way. That could be something that stretches in a bit more this way. It doesn't matter. It's all through these different areas that you would have that outdoor kitchen area. And then the final area here is where we have a sort of communal area, which is where all of the different elements come together. So this may be where we have our dining area, and this allows that space where if the guests are also going to eat outdoors, they can come into that area. Obviously, we have the kitchen right beside it, and it won't interfere with any sort of views. The guest area may be something where you want to also consider the pergola, and the reason being is that if we have anything in this particular area, and it doesn't matter where it actually resides, it could have lighting, it could have a canopy over top, and provide some nice sort of space as an outdoor living space. So think about the flow, how things will actually work. The guest area may be in the middle. We should have the kitchen area obviously close to the dinette area, only because it's also very economical in regards to plumbing, because we want to be able to attach the indoor plumbing to the outdoor plumbing, albeit we can always move to the other side. It has to be justified by a number of reasons, but flow is the most important. How you treat your guests and how you would actually traverse or flow through these different spaces. And this is more or less generally speaking. So you can see you can come up with any kind of design you want. The critical thing, like I said, anywhere, is the fact that you've got some sort of step. And that step is important to remember how this design flows, and that step is up. And that's why it is critical. That's why we're going to have somewhere along here a handrail. And the handrail will basically provide some sort of measure of safety so nobody falls off this particular place. And the handrail could be combined with, let's say, some fixed planters. You can do this sort of thing and combine different elements in there, and that will allow you to have some nice texture. But remember, don't block the view. Albeit you may want to include some sort of planters in around the area so it frames out the view. So from every point that you're sitting or experiencing, you have a different sort of framing of the view. That's not a problem. But what you don't want to do is something where people will put a big planter across both ends and then fill it full of flowers, and it kind of destroys the view. We want really that flow to move in and out through these different spaces. And you can see I'm making a real mess of this, only because this is my idea of, or my implementation of thoughts down on paper, but it's starting to shape what it is I'm trying to do here. And this is where tracing paper really comes in handy, because I could take this and then start looking at the actual sizes of how I want things to come to be. And maybe that's where I'm going to have a planter, but again, it interferes with the area or with the views. So maybe I want to have my planter in this area, or maybe this would be a better area for my steps, and I'll work through the project in that way. How I'm going to work in this particular element and how it's all going to come to be, I haven't got a clue yet. I'm just kind of facing up with the spaces. Then we go to our documentation that shows you how many square feet you need. So you can see right here I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. At that point I've got 20 feet. So for every 20 feet or 10 in this direction, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, that's 200 square feet. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 1,000 can easily be made up in just that area. So we have to be size sensitive. And that's where we start molding this plan, this analysis down into different sizes. And you want to be creative. Once you kind of have this idea in place, then you're ready to move on to look at some actual examples that people have done on other projects for something like this. So at this point, we're ready to do our visual research. We've done our elemental research, all the parts and pieces, and got a pretty good sense of how they work together. But you want to now get an idea of other designs and elements that you may want to include in your project. So for instance here, I'm looking at this pergola. I like the sort of sense of scale and shape of it. I like the handrail that's attached to it. And I like some of the details. I'm not too fussed on the overall canopy, the way they've designed it, but I like the way the pieces come together and the shapes of the pergola and the scale of it. So that's approximately an 8-inch post as opposed to a 6-inch post. The chairs and the arrangements of it, you're kind of guessing at the spaces. So if this is 4 feet wide here, this is 4, 8, 12. Maybe it's 5 feet, 5, 10, 15, somewhere around there, 12 to 15 feet wide. And same with the spacing behind here. I'm looking at the elements and saying, okay, each one of these is approximately the same. It could be 4 foot. If these are 4-foot panels, then you get 4 foot but plus 6 inches. The size of the posts are half the size of the post. If it's 8 and 8 on both sides, it's 4 and 4, 8. So let's say around 4 foot 8 in each panel. That gives you a sense of scale and proportion. I like that. I like that look. I want to include that in my particular project. Now I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, there's the double level effect, and I don't like this intersection. It looks like this just sits on top of it, whereas on the previous one it was more integrated into one another. I like that look better. So this is part of your research, identifying the pieces that you like and then copying them. You may like this particular handrail detail and how it crosses over. Now I'm not fussed on the hot tub, but I like the way the fact that this planter is really low, so it doesn't impede my view, but it also gives a barrier between the two different views. Later on, we're going to look at framing. And one of the things I want you to avoid as much as possible is curves. Curves are very difficult to achieve. There's a lot of framing elements that are involved and a lot of work. Now, some of you may feel that, oh, I'd like to be challenged. This is a huge challenge. If you're going to curve a very small space. And that means that there's very minimum framing. I don't have to worry about overhangs or anything like that. But in order to put the beam across here, it's going to be in several different locations. Eventually you're going to do some beam calculations. You're going to have to calculate each one of them. So save you some time and trouble later on. Don't add a lot of curves, if any. If you can avoid them, that would be great for this particular project. This is the type of detailing I'm looking for. Look at the way they handle this tread. So they've got sort of a framed element. You never want to see any piece of wood's end grain. And if you take a look at this, this is well done. There's no end grain along the top. There's no end grain along the sides, nothing. So this is well done. And even these smaller details where these planters are slightly above the deck level. That's a nice detail. I like it. So I'm trying to gather this information now so that I can include it and implement it in my particular project. Here again we have a curved design. We've got different features to it. This one I'm not so attached to, only because I find that it's very chunky. This is more of a rustic look. The cabinet's rustic. We have a French provincial look. A French chateau look, and it doesn't really have this chunkiness to it, so I'm not fussed on that. Oh, I don't mind this. Again, look at the curves. But what they've done in here is there's a beam here and a beam there, and they've done very subtle curves. So instead of a long sweeping curve, this is really fairly straight. That's fairly straight. Small curve here. This one's a bit of a bigger curve, but still, it's not too bad. This, I'm looking at the neatness, the cleanness of it, and look at the size of these posts. Not too sure. This is great for a contemporary design. Ours isn't, so it may not be the best of designs for us. Here's something a bit more traditional, and in this case the posts actually have some decorative millwork along the base of it. So the post actually runs to the bottom and it's inset into some sort of mechanical housing. And this wood on top is simply decorative. And it's layers of paneling and crown molding or trim molding or shoe molding that give these sort of profiles here that make it a bit more decorative. But it nicely hides how the post is actually connected to the ground level. And you can see again, this isn't a single stretch. This is something that has spacing to it, probably close to about that 14-foot mark. It's a fairly wide space. And then I like the way they use dowels here as opposed to bolts. And dowels are simply that. They're rounded pieces of wood that can actually be used instead of bolts through that. And it gives a nice kind of finish to it. So I like to include that. This sort of indicates different lighting effects, but it's more of a very contemporary, simple design. I'm not too fussed on it. It's too sort of blocked off. And you can see what happens here. Once this grade level is too high, you have to put this handrail around. So not too fussed on this. I want to include what I think is bad as well as good designs. And this one won't cut it for the project. I like this integration. And it's kind of nice the way they brought in the landscaping. Now we're not going to work on this type of landscaping. This is a fixed landscape that's outside of the deck as opposed to inwards. But one of the things I wanted to note were some of the elements that we can't do because they don't meet code. So sometimes you see nice pictures, but they don't meet code. 2 risers at the most. That's a riser, that's a riser. So 1, 2. As soon as we get into 3, we have to put in handrails. And here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 risers. And the risers are really shallow. That's not a very appealing step quality. And you can see how they've had to put in the handrail for that. They've got a bench on this upper level. Now, because of code, we actually can't do this. This is too high. You'd actually have to have a railing. This doesn't meet any sort of code requirement. So I just pointed out that not every picture that we see on the internet is going to meet code. So you may want to pick out parts and pieces of it, but you can't include it all. What is nice is the fact that they've got, again, a nice edge treatment here. They haven't shown any end grain, but these stairs aren't capped off nicely. You'll actually see end grains along them. So it may not be the best of the design. This is kind of interesting because it has multiple levels. Once again, the staircase is far too large for our application, and they would have to, in Ontario, have a handrail along here. They've got a built-in bench. That's kind of nice. There's a built-in bench with a railing. The trees are coming right out of the deck. That's always tough to do, but it's just to show you multiple levels and sight lines, and this seems to do that fairly well. Here's more of a contemporary design, although it's multiple level, and it looks like they're using composite wood. Again, the base of this is pressure treated and post and beam construction, but the actual finish could be a composite material. Composite gives you a nice clean edge, but you're required obviously to have some good carpentry skills in order to do that. And this shows again multitude of levels. They've had to, because there's 1, 2, 3 risers, put handrails all the way along here, and that becomes a challenge. This is nicer if it was only 2 and you put in some fixed planters in along this area to create that barrier to make people go down the stairs without having the ugliness of handrails. Handrails, when there's too many of them, just seems to overpower and overwhelm the design. This is what we're going to do as close as we can to grade. Now grade would be slightly higher, so it's a step off everywhere else except for where we have the 2-step finish. And as I move along here, there we go. This is beautiful, but we're not doing it. It's just too many curves, and again, it's too much of a challenge. But what is nice is here the edge treatment is a double board treated. So here, even though there's no step or there's no visual element here that indicates it's a step, it's simply visually there to separate spaces. And that can be a very nice treatment. However, we can't do this curved wood thing because that's just only available for composites. Here they've used seating as a barrier. This actually doesn't meet code. Code is very specific. Anytime that you have steps, and notice that there are more than 2 risers, it's 4 risers here, this needs a handrail. And a handrail can't be behind a fixed seated space unless it's above the space. So typically along the edge of any handrail or a guard has to be 42 inches. And if you've got a fixed seat, that 42 inches starts at the top of the seat, because the theory is basically somebody can climb on the seat and then climb over the handrail if it's not at the right height. So this is something we cannot do. The other thing I'm going to sort of have you avoid doing is attaching anything to the house. It's a nice piece of architecture. We don't want to combine into it, and this should be avoided on our project. Here's a nice example of built-in planters that complement the deck, that create these barriers of spaces. And you can see it's actually made a sitting space here and a sitting space there and a walk through there, and it has some very interesting features to it. So it doesn't have to be big to be interesting. Here there's a massive drop off, so there's your guardrail that's required. Even though this is 1, 2, 3 risers and should have a handrail, if it just missed that one step, it'd be perfect for our type of project. So these are all examples, good and bad, that I hope they'll sort of inspire you to go out and find your own examples for your project. Once you've got a bunch of them, you can really start nailing down your design to its size, its shape, and what the overall look is going to be.